Throne of Liberty is sometimes a truly spectacular and impressive MMO. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it seems to fail in a couple of key areas. So let's jump in, let's give you my full review. Now, it's no secret at this point that Throne of Liberty and NCSoft have gone through quite a journey. The game was originally billed as an isometric Lineage sequel. I think initially it was called Lineage Eternal and then Project TL. It was then fully reworked and retooled to be a third-person tab target MMO. But it did have at one stage autoplay and offline play. They then changed it and removed that and made the combat a lot more dynamic, only to then pretty much relatively fail in Korea. And now it's probably the biggest MMO release of 2024, hitting well over 300,000 players on release. Now, you do start Throne of Liberty like you start most MMOs, by creating your character. And this is pretty actually impressive. There's lots of possibilities, including the ability to upload a picture of yourself, and then the game will duplicate you digitally. Although to mixed results, it must be said. You will then go through the tutorial, which again has actually been reworked here for the global release. Now, I won't spoil the story, but basically you are a star born and your arm, for whatever reason, is going into these mana frenzies. And this is something you need to solve and you need help with it. Now, I think one of the most immediate things you notice in Throne of Liberty is the graphics. For me, the world is absolutely beautiful. On a technical level, I think everything is very crisp and very pretty indeed. The game is built on Unreal Engine 4, and it is being made by NCSoft, who I mentioned earlier. And really, I think they have done a truly fantastic job visually, and actually in terms of performance as well. In the tutorial though, you'll start learning about the game systems, and there are many, and many of them are quite complicated for somebody who's going to be new to the game. But you'll quickly learn that there are no classes, you simply pick 2 weapons, and it's sort of similar to New World in that sense. Each weapon has a number of abilities for you to choose from, and you have 12 normal ability slots. Now, while technically you only have 1 weapon out at any given time, when you use an ability from a different weapon, the game will instantly switch to that weapon automatically, use the ability, and then instantly switch back. You don't even really see it, it happens that quickly. And it did seem, in my opinion, that pretty much all weapon combinations are viable, but obviously some are much better than others, depending on the different situations that you find yourself in. But there appears to be a lot of different customization within your build, and you can tailor it as such because there's gear slots, skill slots, and more. When you are done though with the tutorial, you land in Castleton, and that's basically the main starting town. At the launch of a server, this is absolutely filled with lots of players, and the performance of the game definitely holds up. At least for me, every time I've done this, it has been fantastic, never really suffered any major issues at all. When you're in Castleton though, you will then progress through the story, and while you're progressing through the story, there'll also be quests that get you to interact with some of the extra systems. Now, this time around, when I tried it in the early access version of the game, I decided to see if I could follow the story and see if it was enjoyable. I've actually played through the leveling, probably more times than I can actually count, but I've reached max level in the game now 4 separate times, and all of the previous times, I just skipped through the story because it's not something I'm that interested in. But this time, I followed it, I paid attention, and it was okay, it was functionable. I would never really say that the story was enjoyable, and without spoiling too much, a lot of the quests seem to be excuses for you to go and get materials only for somebody else to then craft you something, at least at the start of the game. The first time it might be a potion that will help your mana frenzies, another time it's to make some keepsakes for a young girl. I wouldn't say the quests are necessarily revolutionary. Now actually that young girl in the storyline is sort of important as it leads you to a quest about Henry. Again, I'm not really going to fully explain that. But what sort of bugged me a little bit here is the way that the story is connected is that it's not connected. You literally just end up talking to the girl on the street after you are done with the mana potion and her running away to save her sister. I didn't really like the fact that it didn't flow very well and it seemed to just be happenstance. One jarring thing to me though, like from the start, was I could never quite work out if the voices were AI or badly voice acted. Pretty much all of the characters have voices, and that's decent, I actually like that, but a lot of the storylines are often delivered quite flatly. But I would say that if you are trying to pay attention to the story, then it's generally quite easy to follow, and it's told in an okay way. The lines are voiced, either AI or not. There's then a narrator that's recapping the story after the fact. However, you can't disable this, or at least when I've disabled it, she just comes back to the next recap. And then there are cutscenes. There are 3D cutscenes, which, if I'm honest, are truly beautiful and fantastic. And you have these sort of like 2D cutscenes, very similar to New World if you're familiar with that. And they act as sort of more like recaps to the story, rather than pushing the story forward. Effectively, 2D cutscenes are flashbacks and 3D cutscenes are the now. Well, it seems that way. Eventually, the story, I think, expands into vampires and all kinds of crazy stuff, but if I'm truly honest with you, I lost interest around about level 20. I think if you're somebody looking to play the game for a story, well, you should give it a try. The game is free to play, so you don't really lose anything, and the story might captivate you, it might not. Honestly, the story could be probably like an Academy Award winning story, and I still wouldn't pay attention to it. I'm just not that kind of guy. Now, as for the leveling process, some people got to max level in under 5 hours, and the max level in this game is currently level 50. It's actually level 55 in Korea, but we're not going to be there for at least 6 months, I think. But the leveling for most people probably took around about 10 or so hours. If you're going super slow, paying attention to the story, it could maybe be 20 or 30. But that does beg the question whether or not this is too quick for some people. For me, the actual story and the rest of the gameplay content feels sort of somewhat at odds. When you get to the end game, the story basically becomes completely irrelevant. So in that sense, I was sort of quite pleased that it didn't take too long to level. But if you're somebody who's looking for a long leveling RPG experience and a journey, then I don't know if this one would be for you, but it is free, so maybe give it a try. Now, while you are leveling, there are two main types of quests. There are the main story quests, which are purple, and the side quests, which are blue. For some inexplicable reason, they changed the leveling so that if you now just follow the MSQ, you will eventually get kind of stuck. You'll need to get to a certain level milestone before you unlock the next purple quest. I think it was better and less confusing when all you needed to do previously was to just do the MSQ. But when that was the case in the beta, for example, they made it so that the blue quests didn't give you experience, and that also felt bad. I feel like the best thing to have done here would have been to allow you to get to the end game to max level 50 by just doing the purple quests, but also let you over level if you do the blue quests as well. Either way, its functions, I don't think it's necessarily fantastic though. I'm not really a huge fan of quests just appearing when you hit a milestone. I'd prefer maybe going to have to talk to somebody to get the ball rolling, but it was okay. I'm nitpicking there. It's not really a big issue. Okay, so that's sort of the story and leveling. Let's talk a little bit more about the world that you're doing it in. Yes, I said earlier that I do think the world is truly beautiful, by the way. Like, graphically, the game is impressive. Sometimes, there's a sunset. The render distance is incredible. The lighting can be very nice. It all looks pretty, but in my opinion, the world sort of feels a little bit generic. Everything feels pretty, but also bland and maybe a little vapid. I also personally found that it sort of felt and seemed that my character didn't really feel at the right scale with the rest of the world. Doorways felt a little bit too big, buildings feel a little bit too big, and I feel a little bit too small and insignificant in the world. And this, I think, adds to an effect of just feeling disconnected at times. But as I said, the world is very pretty, it's beautiful, technically it's fantastic, I think. But what's really important to me is the gameplay and the content. And this is an area where I personally run into an immediate issue, and that's to do with the movement and the combat. The game is a tab target MMO, and it has sort of two combat settings. It has a classic setting, which is basically just normal tab target, and it has an action combat setting, which is sort of like ESO, but it's effectively just tab target, slightly obscured. But for some people, that action camera can feel a bit more engaging. To put it bluntly though, I dislike the combat and the movement, and that's really the main deal breaker for me when it comes to Throne of Liberty. Now, I just said I dislike the combat, and you're going to be like, well, why is that, Jay? And the truth is, it's going to be very hard to describe why it feels the way that it does. The movement and the combat feels sort of simultaneously both floaty and clunky. I'm going to try to do my best to describe this feeling and why I think it is, but I might fail because I think it's just opinion at the end of the day. There's a lot of people, however, who agree with me, and perhaps even more people who don't agree with me. Some people like it, some people don't. There's definitely a split on the combat issue. It's just whether or not you're personally impacted or not. Now, I mentioned the movement, so let's talk about the movement first. I think the traveling is a little bit awkward. Traversing over rocks, using your morph, which your morph is basically an instantly transformable mount, but instead of you riding a horse, you turn into a wolf. The furry lovers, by the way, they're going to have a great time. When you're gliding, you turn into a bird, and when you're swimming, you turn into, I don't know, an otter or whatever hell you decide to morph into. The movement overall just feels a little bit awkward. Now, for the movement during combat, that's where it really starts to actually bug me. And there's a couple of different things, and they may actually have reasons why they are the way that they are, but I just didn't like it. One of them is when you start attacking, your character will slow down. Obviously that makes sense for balance, but in the game I think it sort of makes it feel a little bit clunky. Another issue is that when you are attacking an enemy and you sort of hold right click or left click if you change the setting, and you try to turn the camera and run away, your character will still face whatever you are attacking until you get out of range. You need to sort of press X or transform into your morph to really get away. Now maybe there's a setting to disable that, but I didn't see it. There are times when your character will desync when using an ability. You'll just slide a meter or so. I think the abilities themselves can feel clunky with the animations. For some of them you need to be rooted, for some of them you don't. I also don't really like the spell effects, but the one saving grace here is that you can turn them all off. When I participated in a massive siege, I did not turn them off and I couldn't see anything. That was on me. Obviously I should have turned them off, but at the time I didn't know. I also don't really like the skill shots. For some reason, maybe getting stuck on terrain, maybe it's just the way that you have to aim them. I didn't like it. They have removed the camera smoothing issue, which if I'm honest, does help a lot. What I would say is that a lot of these issues are more felt in melee than ranged. So if you are finding the combat clunky or you just don't like it, I would recommend switching to some ranged weapons because I feel like that can be a little bit more mobile and it was a little bit more fun. In a lot of my playthroughs beforehand, I'd played melee, and then for these playthroughs, I'd played the staff and the bow, and it felt okay. Nothing to write home about, but it was okay. The game's combat is sort of relatively simple tab target, which if I'm honest feels completely straight out of 2008. However, it does have the introduction of an active block and an active dodge. Now by pressing Q when you're not moving, you will do a weapon specific defense ability, which is a block. But if you press Q while you are moving, you will do a little roll, which is a dodge. These sort of give you something akin to an iframe, but it's not really an iframe. In PvE, there will be a purple indicator that says, you know, block this attack. And you can do a block or you can do a perfect block, and your defensive ability then varies depending on which one you've done. And then you have a specific defense ability tied to whatever weapon you are using. In PvP, I think you generally want to block something called the Fury attacks, which obviously you can do when you know when to expect them. Now, I'm personally nowhere near good enough to do that in PvP, but it is an option that will increase the skill gap for those of you who want it. I also think there's an issue with a lack of visual clarity. Now, the issue here is the more you play the game, the more you will recognize what is happening in the game. Because I was playing some small scale PvP in the arena, and eventually I found myself being able to understand and predict people's abilities. And that was at some points enjoyable. There are some abilities which are like instant teleports, that will then like lock you in CC and you just get chain CC'd and you can basically not do much once it's happened. But I did get better the more that I know. So I sort of suspect the more you know, the better it might feel. The problem is I didn't enjoy the process learning because I don't think it felt very good. I also don't really like the animations in the combat. It looks awkward, and I think that sort of affects the feel as well. Overall, the combat's going to be difficult to describe. I tried to do my best then. I would suggest again, play it. It's free to play. If you like the combat, you probably enjoy the game. If you don't though, then for me, that's a deal breaker. For you, it might not be. And in NCSoft's defense, they've put a lot of effort in the combat. At one point, you couldn't actually attack and move, but they removed autoplay. They made it so you could attack and move, and that definitely did help the flow. They've also introduced some skill specialization, which lets you customize your skills to your taste, which I do think helps the combat feel better. But personally, I still somehow think that you can tell that the game was built with autoplay in mind, and trying to change this fundamentally hasn't quite paid off. That might be unfair, but that's my opinion. What I would say is that one massive advantage to this kind of combat is what it facilitates. Now, I'll talk more about this later, but the combat being this way is probably one of the things that allows the game to pull off some incredible and impressive mass scale PvP. You would definitely not be able to do something like this in an action combat game, for example. But ultimately, I don't think that trade-off is worth it, but for you, it might be. So let's talk about the content, what you will actually be doing at the end game day in, day out. And to be honest, I think Throne of Liberty has a fair chunk of content. It has most of the things that you can expect, and the things that you would expect that aren't there are probably coming in the next 3 to 6 months. NCSoft have been making content at a very good rate, and there are some big things coming in literally either October or November, which will be including Battlegrounds and more. In fact, due to the game already being out in Korea for nearly a year, there's content that is ready to go when the players have caught up and are ready for that content. There's going to be tier 2 dungeons instead of tier 1, there's going to be a level increase, a new zone, and much more. NCSoft have definitely been responsive and communicative and very busy in the last year, and I think NCSoft should be given some credit in that regard. As for the content, well, perhaps one of the most interesting content ideas in Throne of Liberty are these regularly scheduled events. Now, some of this content is behind milestones, and I'm not really going to explain what they are, but they're server-wide achievements that unlock the next bit of content. For some people, they do not like that, by the way. But these timed events are broken down into a couple of different variations, but they all happen on the hour, generally 3 hours apart from the same type of content or longer. But there's something happening almost every hour in the evenings at least. But these do happen in the early morning if that's when you're able to play. So there are a couple of type of events, as I said. One of them is a peaceful event where players will compete in some kind of PvE activity to see who gets the most wolves tails or something like that. There's a cooperative mode where you actually all work together to get a better reward. And then there is a guild event. Now, guild events are where guilds compete, but it is with PvP enabled. If you're a solo player here, you don't want to try this event. But all the guilds will try and do the PvE task that you would normally do, except you can fight over it, and the bigger PvP guild or the better PvP guild will probably win that. My favorite type of these events though is something called the Dominion event, which is sort of like a soft faction PvP event. When you enter it, you will be assigned a random faction color from 3 colors. So there's no pre-made groups, although there is actually a party finder once you've been assigned a faction. And you do the same PvE task as whatever that area would be, but now there's 3 different factions vying for it. So you don't have to be in a guild, you can do this sort of solo effectively, and it's PvP, and I found it quite fun. We'll come back to the guild PvP in a minute, because in Throne of Liberty there's a huge question about Zergs and if it's fun or not, but we'll talk about that in a second. Another type of timed event are the world bosses. These are broken down into PvE and PvP versions. The PvE version will have several different gates spawn, I think actually 5 different gates, and they're basically instanced so that everybody's spread out where you don't have thousands of people all trying to kill the same boss. I think each server in Throne of Liberty is like 6,000 people, so pretty damn huge. You kill the world boss and you get gear. In PvE it's just random, but in the PvP mode it's not actually instanced, it's in the open world, and it is highly contested because the guild that does the most damage is very likely to get the loot for their guild. So it's less random than PvE, because if you destroy everybody and your guild does most of the damage against the boss, then you're likely going to get the best gear, and the best gear does come from these world bosses. Eventually there'll be an arch boss, but I've not experienced that yet. There's another type of timed event called Conquest, which is broken down into 2 types. You have the Boonstones and the Wriststones. Wriststones effectively enable you to kill a boss for loot, where only your guild has access to it. So it's sort of similar to the world PvP boss, except you have to fight for a stone first. And Boonstones, they give you materials. Now, the first time that these are contestable, it will be a full-on Zerg. But then after that, it will become a 1 guild versus 1 guild event. And then eventually there'll be an inter-server guild event, which is the same thing, but you get to fight people on other servers for the same stone. Now, the important thing is a guild is 70 people maximum, but 1 guild can ally with 3 other guilds, so there's 240 people in an alliance. And right now, a lot of these alliances are simply just mega guilds, just spread out. Now, at the time of recording, I haven't actually done these Boonstone Wriststones, but I think this would be one of the more enjoyable PvP systems because it's less of a Zerg once you actually get into it. Yes, the first time is Zergable, but the next time it won't be, and actually the best guilds will fight for the most lucrative ones, and the smaller guilds will be able to fight for the less lucrative ones. At some point, NCSoft has said they might do stuff for smaller guilds, but this would be a really cool system, I think, for all different types of guilds, because there's many of them on the map, so I think it would be good for guilds that are not in huge alliances. I think there's enough to go around, basically. The other type of event is a siege event. Now, on global, nobody has done this on the global server because it's actually only happening in November. But I was lucky enough to participate in the sponsored Siege the Day event that Amazon Games produced. Now, Amazon Games are the publisher for this game, and I would say that they have done a mostly okay job, especially with some of the monetization actually. The only massive issue has been some serious server issues in EU, and it's been pretty bad in EU. But the Siege overall will eventually happen every other week. I don't think that's changed yet, and it will be on a weekend, typically like a Saturday evening. Almost all the important events happen in the evenings, which makes sense. There's also a caravan system, but I don't know too much about that, so I'm not going to talk about it, but I believe it's a massive Zerg. As I said, we are going to come back to Zerg, just bear with me. Let's move on to the other type of bosses. So in your guild base, which isn't customizable by the way, there is a portal where you can go and fight bosses. These bosses are basically the same that you get in the open world, but only your guild has access to it, so only your guild will get the loot. It's kind of like raiding, but not really, but kind of. The numbers, I think, are flexible. I think you can do it with all 70 of you. Eventually, NCSoft has said they're going to be doing 12-person raids. I think that's either coming in December or sometime soon. Right now, though, for dungeons, we have 3 dungeons that you can do while you are leveling, which then get reused at max level for a total of 6 endgame dungeons, which you and 5 others will go through. Now, to find a group, you can either pre-mate with friends, global chat, or a guild or what have you, or you can use the party board, which actually most people are currently using. But there is an auto match group finder as well. The dungeons themselves are fun enough. There's mechanics, there's everything you would expect in PvE. Yeah, I would give this a thumbs up. I actually sort of thought the mechanics were decent. The visuals of the dungeons were decent. The bosses were good. All good. You actually get a box when you complete the dungeon. You open the box and the box sort of costs you tokens. Now these tokens you will generate each day, but you can stack them maybe up to like a week's worth. But if you were doing all the dungeons you could, you would basically do 3 dungeons a day. Now, I did run into 2 main issues though when I was doing dungeons. One of them is just MMO players being MMO players. A lot of people were expecting perfection with everybody knowing the mechanics, even though the game was 2-3 days old when we were doing these. I personally found the mechanics sort of easy to understand. If you hadn't done the dungeon before, somebody could easily explain it to you, or the first time you see it fail, you could learn it. I didn't find it too hard myself, apart from maybe the level 30 dungeon, but let's not talk about that. But the moment somebody would fail, the group would skedaddle. That's just MMO players being MMO players. I don't necessarily blame TL for that, apart from the fact that the game's a relatively solved game, so the expectation is a bit higher than normal. Now, the next issue though would be queue times. Sometimes the queues would be 15 minutes or longer, and they wouldn't pop, and I would just leave because I was getting bored. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of people are actually using the party board, which they can then set the requirements, and they do this to ensure quick runs. But I think a bigger issue was actually a lack of tanks and healers for certain dungeons. Now, we'll talk more about progression soon, but some dungeons don't have loot for certain weapons, which means that some roles don't try to do that dungeon. I was looking at the party board for one dungeon, and there were literally dozens and dozens of group all filled except for a tank. And at this stage, a lot of people don't actually have multiple builds and can't flex and that kind of thing. So while the dungeons are fun, I feel like there could be some kind of reward or bonus for healers and tanks, and I think that would help the situation. I believe maybe the idea is that healers and tanks will run every dungeon, get these tokens and then craft what they've not got. But in reality, people are trying to target farm gear, specific items, and if the dungeon doesn't have the item they want, they're not doing it, which is fair enough. I think the people leaving is just a people issue. I think the lack of tanks and healers though is a design issue. Dungeons are fun when you can do them though. And later this year, there's actually going to be an extra difficulty tier with more dungeons, and then eventually there'll be like a Mythic Plus kind of system, but that's not out here yet. There's also something called the Secret Dungeon, which is basically a tower of bosses that you complete solo. Some of these you can do as your level, and some of them you need to be level 50. For the first time you do these though, you get some good material rewards and some XP actually. I personally found these to be relatively good fun. All the bosses have some mechanics, maybe ranging from a scorpion that you have to follow and drag into a specific sand pit, or maybe just jumping an AoE wave. A lot of them have mechanics and I found them fun. And then actually there's sort of like an end game version of this where there's leaderboards for all the weapon combinations. And I actually think you can do these special contracts for extra rewards. Whilst all of these battles take place in the same circular arena, Sometimes the texture will change. Maybe it'll be sand, maybe it'll be pillars coming out of the ground. Overall, I found that to be quite enjoyable. A good reuse of space and boss mechanics. One of my absolute favourite pieces of content is not really a surprise to people who watch me on Twitch, is the fact I really enjoyed the 3v3 arena. Now, there are a couple of different options in the 3v3 arena. Very importantly though, it's worth noting that there is no gear equalization here. So if you are ahead, you will just be, but the options are ranked and not ranked. You can do it as a 3, you can do it as a solo. There's 2 interesting maps. One of them's a boring circle, one of them is this sort of like sci-fi block thing, which I don't really like, but I do like the space, just not the theme. And there's a fun twist on killing each other. For example, in the last minute, there becomes this thing where you have to loot tokens off other players and then hold on to them, which can cause some twist endings. For me, this was by far the most fun content I had with the game. Actually, probably the only time I really enjoyed the game beyond the secret towers. I did, however, experience one issue here. The game sort of had this 5-day head start early access. Except it's not really a head start because they were different servers. If you paid, you could start 5 days earlier, and then there would be new servers 5 days later that the free people could play on. And in theory, they are completely separate. The trading post, for example, would not interact because that would be busted. Eventually, that distinction and difference will mellow out and you'll be able to actually transfer wherever you want, but in theory you couldn't transfer from the early access to the free to play, so there was no crossover. However, that did not apply for the arena. The arena was still shared. For the first couple of days of the free to play, I would do the arena, but I'd be playing against people who are 5 days ahead. And for a lot of people, I think that might just feel very bad because to me, I could very much feel it when somebody was on an advanced server with much better gear. Obviously, some of them will have just been higher skill as well. Pretty much a double whammy for me. Even with that though, I did find the arena to be some of the best content, but that's more my kind of content. Moving on, there are 2 types of open world kind of content. One of them are these open world dungeons where you will basically take a group of people and you'll go and farm specific items in a specific open world dungeon. Now while you are farming these, you will spend abyss tokens. These will give you XP, Solent, which is basically the in-game gold, and very importantly, the chance of getting loot. While you are farming a specific item, by the way, don't underestimate the importance of the Solent currency, because eventually when you get to mid to late game, you will want that currency. Early on, while you're leveling, not really a big issue. The Abyss tokens though, they will regenerate each day, but you can stockpile some of them as well. However, you can get more tokens from doing some of the contracts, but the contracts are capped as well. So those contracts, which are the next type of content, they're effectively like a town board, except it's not a town board, it's a person. These are quests, which you can actually do a variety of these while you're leveling, but ultimately you should probably hold off and not do any contracts until you're max level. You do these contracts, you get materials, you get tokens, what have you. I think you get 10 per day, but you can store around 60. So again, not quite a week's worth, but if you're off for a couple of days, don't worry, you don't massively lose out. It's like dailies, except you can, if you want to, complete them weekly. In fact, that's the same for a lot of those, isn't it? The instant dungeon, the open world dungeon, and the contracts are all dailies that you can stockpile and do them almost at your leisure, as long as you do them within the limit, basically. Otherwise, some of them will go to waste. Some people might not enjoy that kind of time gating. For me, it's not really a big issue. I don't like it, I don't dislike it. It's pretty important because it's sort of integral to the progression of the game. And we do need to talk about progression, and I've been kind of deliberately avoiding it. I've been avoiding it because we're going to have to talk about the topic of pay to win. I'm not going to pussyfoot around it. I'm not going to call it pay to progress, pay to fast. I'm not going to accept that if you can earn it in game, then it's not pay to win. I'm not going to accept that there's some skill involved, because of course there is. Let's be clear, we all know that pay to win isn't where you pay and you have a 100% chance of victory. We all know that being ahead means that while you are ahead, you can have an improved chance of winning. We're going to talk more about the pay to win in Throne of Liberty, but I'm going to give you my definition right now, and then you know where I'm coming from. If once you have got into the game itself offers you a way of paying to get a competitive advantage against other players, then it's pay to win. And in this game, you can. But to explain how it works, we need to talk about just normal gearing progression. So let's do that. Gearing in Throne of Liberty is kind of interesting, but for me, never really enjoyable. There's a couple of different systems. One of them is a skill leveling up system, and you can sort of get, craft, obtain various different skill books that will then level up your skills and abilities. This includes your defensive skill, your active skill, and your passive skills. And these follow a tiered progression: green, blue, and purple. Green abilities need green books, blue need blue books, and purple need purple books. There's also weapon skill leveling, which seems really quite slow, but very strong. You get these sort of like tier drop icons that will boost this over time, I think, when you do contracts. Another massive way to improve your character though is obviously through the equipment, which if you play the game, it starts off being grey in each slot, and then there's a variety of different ways that the game will allow you to progress. The whole thing is quite complicated. The pay to win is complicated. The gearing system is complicated. To put it mildly, I think a lot of this complication is important and actually intended to distract you ultimately from the pay to win. This video right here is not really a guide, but I'll do my best to explain it very simply, but just know that I might be cutting corners to explain it. If you're a hardcore fan, I probably know what you think I'm missing, but if I explained everything, I'd be boring people to death. Well, I'm probably doing that anyway, but even more so. When you are leveling or you're at the end game, you will get some items from quests, open world drops, and indeed the auction house. Very early on, you'll be given some green items. These green items you can level up in a couple of different ways. You can level them up both like the item level, and you can add trait and then actually level up the traits. Now you level up your items by its level by using these growth stones. For a green, it's capped as 6, but then if you get a blue item, interestingly, you can actually transfer that XP. So a level 6 green goes to a level 3 blue, and then a level 9, which is the max for blue, transferred to a purple, I think goes to level 6. So definitely worth doing. Items themselves can have traits. I think greens have 2 traits, and then blue and purple will have 3 traits. Again, this system's quite complicated. This is not a guide, but these traits can also be added and then leveled up. Now, really, for me, it's the gearing where the pay to win shines. Yes, there's a battle pass and a leveling pass, which you can argue is pay to win. Not too flustered about those, not going to dwell on them. But it's actually the items. Now, I'm going to try and explain why. So let's say you find a purple item early on. Maybe it's the purple chest that you get from doing the quest. Or maybe you buy an item, maybe through getting the lithograph, or maybe it being a tier 2 arch boss weapon, or whatever you right. Just assume it's a purple item that you want to upgrade. Now it will have 1 trait on it by default. And what you want to do obviously is level up the item itself using the growth stones, but it's the traits really where the pay to win starts to shine. It'll have 1 trait on it, and what you will want to do is add 2 more traits and then level up all of these traits 2 more times. Now, how do you unlock the traits? Well, for purple item, you can actually use something called a trait unlock stone. Most of these, I think you actually get from the battle pass and the leveling log. I think you also get that from the lithograph hand-ins as well. But instead of doing that, you can go to the trading post, find an extract of the trait that you want of the same item. Buy that and then add it to your nice purple item. That will unlock the trait. Now, the reason this whole thing is pay to win is because the trading post is a real money trading post. The currency is called Lucent, and you can buy Lucent for cash. Now, whilst it's true you are buying these items from other players, minus some tax, it still allows the very rich people to get ahead by paying. And that is the crux of the pay to win. Once you actually have the trait, by the way, you then want to level up the trait. Now, you do that in a similar way to unlocking a trait, except you can use different items to try and increase the trait. So you can actually use blue items with the same trait to try and improve your purple, but it will often fail, and then you get this like bad luck prevention called blessing. Or what you can do, if it's like a weapon, you can simply buy the trait you want that is on any other purple weapon, which can be a bit cheaper than buying the exact same weapon that you have or you want. That's the same for armor as well, but it needs to be the same slot. So let's say you want max health on a chest piece, and your current chest piece does have it, but you want to improve it, you can buy it from any chest piece. If, however, you wanted max health and it's not currently on your item, it needs to be the exact same chest piece extract. Right. That was overly simple. It's more complex than that. But if I talked about it as long as I probably would have to talk about it to satisfy everybody, to make it seem like I fully understood and I fully explained it, it would just be completely boring. The TLDR is, it is pay to win. You pay for power. I would say that it being complicated and obfuscated is part of the way that they get you. And when you figure it out, it allows you a big advantage over other players. Now, there are some reasons to think that the pay to win in Throne of Liberty isn't actually that bad. For example, you can catch up. It's basically capped. It's not like infinite grind. So what will happen effectively is that the people who pay will get ahead of the free-to-play players, but then the free-to-play players will eventually sort of near enough catch up. They might never catch up when there's arch boss weapons, and it's going to go through different phases where actually it's not that big, but then maybe in a month's time it'll be worse, and then 2 months it won't be that bad. It all depends on what content is unlocked with the milestones, what items are available, and that kind of thing. I'd say go and watch Canon if you really want to understand the pay to win, but it is pay to win. There's no two ways about it. For me, a very simple way of thinking about pay to win is if you could play against you and one of you paid, and at some point you had a competitive advantage against your other self, then that would be pay to win. It doesn't matter to me if you eventually can catch up, especially not in a PvP game like Throne of Liberty, because you have that advantage right now. You win right now. And yes, there is some skill element to the game. And yes, there's actually a rock, paper, scissors element to the game. But if you cancel all of that out, maybe you're a rock versus a rock, maybe you've paid versus not paid, maybe it's the same skill versus the same skill and the same weapons, etc., then paying gives you an advantage at some times. I'm going to shut up talking about pay to win. Honestly, we could talk about it forever. One of the reasons I would say the pay to win's not actually as bad as some people might be thinking right now is because I think it's less pay to win and more you need to be in a guild if you really want to progress. Some guilds, however, were making sure that to get into the guild, you needed to be a payer rather than a free player. Because Throne of Liberty, though, is really about being in an organized, massive guild/alliance. That's actually where most of the power will really come from. And that's where most of the winning is done. And actually, that's one incredibly technically impressive thing with Throne of Liberty. The large-scale performance is pretty damn amazing in PvP. In the open world battles, there will easily be several hundreds, if not occasionally thousands of people, even just for the guild events and the world bosses. And in the siege, very easily over 1,000 players sometimes. Honestly, it's incredible. It's very, very impressive. If you're someone looking for a mass scale PvP game on a truly spectacular scale, then Throne of Liberty could very easily be for you. For me though, it's not overly enjoyable. And yes, this time around I was participating with a guild and doing the events and stuff like that. But the first reason I don't like it is that your individual impact is sort of relatively small. Yes, obviously with coordination, you can have your big AoEs, your stuns, your sleeps, and you can make a difference. But in just a 1,000 person fight, you are quite literally 0.1% of that battlefield, which for me, it just feels a little bit futile, but you might think it's epic. I also don't really enjoy the visuals. Everything is very cluttered. And yes, you can change the settings to make it less so and make it more appealing to yourself. But visually, I really did not like it. Especially when everybody is morphed, it just sort of looks like a swarm of rats at times. The best part though is being on Discord, talking to people, playing as part of a team and working together. If you like that and you're looking for that on a big scale, again, Throne of Liberty could be an option for you. I think there's a lot to play without the Zerg, but the Zerg is really going to be needed because that's where the best gear comes from. The best gear really comes from these guild bosses, the arch bosses when they come out as well. And if you have control over those, and you need like 240 people to be doing that by the way, then you will start getting the best gear. And that almost is a bigger issue than the pay to win, honestly. But that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing, depending on your viewpoint. One thing I didn't really enjoy was the game sort of feeling like it was a solved game. For some people, they've been playing this game since Korea. They know everything inside and out. Like, I've been following the game, but I've never really gone super hardcore because I didn't want to do on the Korean version. I didn't really have the time in the beta to go beyond level 50 because it was only like 5 days long. I think though, the fact that a lot of people knew what they were doing and a lot of guides already existed somewhat took the shine off that new MMO feeling. Now, obviously people coming to the game later on won't experience that anyway, but I wanted to experience that, and it was a little bit dulled down because a lot of it was already solved. Overall though, there's definitely things to enjoy about the game. The world is beautiful, the optimization and the performance is very good even in mass PvP. The story has nice cutscenes, the mass PvP is definitely a plus for some people. There's definitely a lot of content, I think, with a lot more content coming, and there's decent progression. And really for the things that I don't like, it's actually quite subjective, so maybe give it a try anyway. However, I would say that I think the world, even though it's pretty, is sort of generic. I personally found the story to be boring. The mass PvP was a Zerg fest and I honestly didn't like it. The combat and the movement is something that really doesn't click with me. The game's starting to get a lot of bots because it's free to play. And really, as I said many times throughout this video, the fact that it's free to play is probably the most important part. It's free to try. If you're on the fence, give it a try. Fundamentally, for me, the combat and the movement is really the deal breaker. Yes, I don't really like the Zerg, and yes, I don't really like the pay to win, but on their own, those two things would not be a deal breaker for me. The combat and the movement though, just is. And as I said, that's subjective. Some of you might like it. However, in my personal opinion, NCSoft have done a fabulous job effectively polishing a turd. Now that might seem a little bit harsh, but I think the core, which is the combat and the movement, isn't very good. Probably because it was built with autoplay in mind. But NCSoft have done a great job covering in chocolate, putting sprinkles on it, and really developing the game. But I think the core doesn't click with me, and quite honestly, I can still smell the crap. The game's doing very well though. As I said many times, it's free to play. Give it a try. There's a lot to enjoy if you enjoy some of the things that I don't enjoy. But for me, I'm sort of at a loss. Like, the game just doesn't click with me. I don't like it. I don't think it's very good. But many people are enjoying it. Go ahead. Give it a bash. It's just my opinion after all. Let me know yours. For now, have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye. God damn, that was a long one, wasn't it?